But we still have the legal problem. How is it that Human Rights Watch or Amnesty can report on these things?
And that's where we are now.
And that's where we are now. So it's the late 1980s, so this legal history question. So the states are saying, well, it's not the Kenyan government, it's not X government, we're not doing the cutting, it's not Egypt, it's people, in fact, aunts, mothers. How should you take this up? Okay. In my class last week, we read, and this is my little mini lecture, this is the history of a legal idea. Last week we read about a decision in 1988 that came out of the Inter-American Court. It's a decision, and I didn't make PowerPoints, but I can give the sort of outline for this if it's helpful for folks, called Velazquez-Rodriguez. And in this decision, the Inter-American Court, which is a human rights court that has the power to make decisions and define governments, this human rights court says, you, the government of Honduras, may not have disappeared, basically kidnapped, tortured, and then killed this Honduran student activist, but because you took no steps to respond. You, the government, never investigated. You never made it possible for an investigation. You did nothing to help the family find their son or brother. You did nothing to offer remedies to the family for the disappearance of their kid. Because you sat quiet, and you have become the equivalent of legally complicitous in that disappearance. So the state, which didn't carry out the abuse, and normally under international human rights law, the state has to have done the action. The state hasn't carried out the abuse, but the state failure to respond to the abuse with investigation, with prevention, with investigation, and with remedies makes the state internationally accountable under human rights law for that violation they didn't carry out. And that moment is the click moment for the women's groups, because they look at female genital cutting or mutilation, they look at domestic violence, they look at all these forms of abuse that are not carried out by the state. They're carried out. Mothers, sisters, aunts, husbands, partners.
Right. The honor killing we have in our reading this time would be an example of that.
So the notion of people killed by their family because of some alleged or real kind of dispute over their sexual kind of chastity and behavior, that's the moment where the women's groups go, ha, legal doctrine, serious court, Inter-American Court, says government that fails to respond, that is not, in the phrase they use, employ due diligence. It doesn't do what a good state would do when one of its citizens was violated. The state failing to be diligent to respond has become accountable. And the women's groups go, bingo. The failure to respond to a widespread, well-known, systematic set of abuses, in the case of FGM, clearly not a hidden practice, right? But the failure to respond makes the state responsible. And the women's groups add a kind of extra fillip of, and by the way, their failure to respond is discriminatory. They have no laws that say this particular action, either domestic violence or FGM, is violence against women. They don't care. The failure to care is an element of their discriminatory treatment of women. And that failure makes them legally responsible. We can complain to the state for their failure to respond to the cutting of girls and women. So that's the click moment for women's groups, where they can then go back and actually, I mean, those of us who were in Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, we were busy working that sort of stuff through. We go back to our legal offices and go, guess what, guys? If the Honduran state can be responsible for the acts of death squads, if Germany, and there was a similar report that came out in 1992, and this is when we really nailed it with Human Rights Watch, if Human Rights Watch can put out a report that the failure of the German police to respond to skinhead violence, to racist violence against Turkish migrants in Germany, if Human Rights Watch can say that that's a state failure, then how come Human Rights Watch can't say that it's a state failure to protect human rights when girls and women face cutting? And they basically had to agree. As a matter of legal doctrine, the whole sort of this new legal doctrine became a standard within human rights with a gender-specific component, and FGM enters the world of formal human rights in the early 1990s.
Stop taking people's questions.
Yeah.
Yes.
This was an Inter-American Court, right? Was that sort of equivalent in Europe?
The equivalent to the Inter-American Court in Europe is the European Court of Human Rights.
They also make it within
The European Court was a little slower on the due diligence game. Their decision on due diligence was basically 1996. But the European Court has accepted due diligence and state obligation for private actor violence. There's an earlier Dutch case that the European Court dealt with in 1989 where they're a little unclear, but they say, yes, this girl who was raped in a private, she was developmentally disabled, and she was in a private care home, and she was raped. And in the European Court, in that case, said the failure to protect her from sexual violence in this private custodial home was the obligation of the Netherlands. So the European Court had taken it on since '89, and then formally articulated it in '96.
So it's also, women's rights in Europe are also.
They can use and are using it. Although interesting, this is a longer conversation, but European women's rights groups tend to use the UN Convention more than the European Court, in part because the European Court has been so historically weak on gender discrimination.
Listen, our class, you might remember, we did this case, we talked briefly about the case of domestic violence, the failure to protect the woman from her husband in Colorado, and that was a case that came up before the
Inter-American
Court.
Commission. But yeah, it's same body, Inter-American. So
And
Jessica,
that was a case in which the world, it doesn't, America isn't bound by it.
Right.
But it's an important precedent, and in the world one takes
right.
a serious
And
course.
can I say the truly crazy thing about the Jessica Gonzalez case? So this is the case that Colorado, woman faces, she has a temporary restraining order on her husband. Husband has the kids, 3 kids turn up dead with the cops having paid no attention. She goes to the Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court says, not the state's problem. The violence was not committed by the police. It was the police failure to act. Police failure to act is not the problem of the U.S. government. The Supreme Court says no constitutional violation. She then goes to the Inter-American system, which has this legal doctrine of state accountable for failure to respond for widespread or systematic kinds of abuse. Domestic violence has been accepted by the U.S. as a widespread problem for women. And interestingly enough, the U.S., which for decades never sent a response to Inter-American Commission inquiries, not only sends a response, but shows up for the hearing and responds. So if you're interested, the ACLU and the Columbia Human Rights Clinic have on their website the YouTube videos of the U.S. government sitting there responding to the Inter-American Commission, asking it questions, which is a kind of a stunning moment for those of us who are in the U.S., which has tended not to show up at international and answer questions at international human rights law-based kinds of meetings.
Yes. We have a tradition here of answering
Yeah,
questions.
yeah, and so I mean, same for my class. Obviously, everybody should feel free to ask. And for those of you from my class, this is where the Charlotte Bunch and the Donna Sullivan readings are smack on. So,
We were in Charlotte Bunch. Yes.
yep.
Sorry, it's just a minor question. What was the woman's name who brought the issue to the attention?
The Jessica Gonzalez.
I just have a question on this framing things as women's rights, human rights, and distinctions. Doesn't the distinctions just perpetuate the same kind of divisions that cause inequality in the first place? For instance, when we talk about female genital mutilation, and in the initial investigations it was a health concern, they were
Right.
looking at whether there's a health effect, and that was because there was already a precedent that was set and accepted by states that genital mutilation wasn't in of itself a human rights issue because we had
There was no acceptance by states of that when WHO was
well, there's
working on it.
widespread circumcision in Western states, and that's never been questioned as a human rights issue.
Oh, I see.
I've been
Sorry.
socialized to be happy with my penis, so I'm not saying
Right.
that I'm trying
Sorry.
to change that. I'm just saying these distinctions
Right.
seem to cloud the issue and sort of perpetuate the inequality.
I'm still not, maybe I missed your, I clearly jumped in too soon. What's your point about the distinction?
Well, because-
Health doesn't drop out of the story of
Because by
FGC.
framing things as women's rights
Right.
versus human rights, minority
Ah.
rights, by making those distinctions,
Okay.
you perpetuate and reinforce the same inequalities that cause or the same differences that cause the inequalities in the first place, which is why we don't see things for what they are, which is why it was seen as a health issue, I think. Well, I know there was other reasons,
Right.
but that may be why we're seeing differences.
But
because
I
we're framing them as
think
different.
what I hear, the story that I'm trying to tell, or at least is this very, and I'm a little, I've got my own ambivalence, but the story I'm telling is that people who'd been working on the health side of FGC, FGM, on the women's side, decided that that exclusion of the issue from human rights, the mainstream of human rights, was part of the problem. And they wanted the women's rights issues inside human rights. So it's not that human rights is over here and women's rights is over here. It's that women's rights fits within the human rights system
I think
and
what Marge
practice.
is trying to say is that